So, welcome everybody, and my name is Anna Graham, host of this Neurocalm Fatigue Summit, and I'm beyond excited to have with me today Dr Maya Shetreat, who is absolutely incredible. She's a neurologist, herbalist, urban farmer, and author of The Dirt Cure, a book that's been translated into 10 languages. She's been featured in the New York Times, Telegraph, NPR, Sky News, The Dr. Oz Show, and more. And Dr. Maya is the founder of the Terrain Institute, where she teaches earth-based programs for transformational healing, including professional training programs for psychedelic-assisted approaches. She works and studies with indigenous communities and healers from around the world, and is a lifelong student of ethnobotany, plant healing, and the sacred. And it's absolutely brilliant to start this with you today, Maya. So thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So Maya, I'd love you to address this moment that we find ourselves at in human history, which of course is also animal and biotic and planetary history. It seems as though there's an epidemic of fatigue and all sorts of crises and stress on the earth. And I think it's just really important to position us where we are right now. And I'd love your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different angles or ways that we could talk about it. But for me, the crux of this particular moment, which has been coming for a long, long time, um, and we're maybe in a climactic part of it now, is really this state of disconnection and kind of a sense of, I'd say, compartmentalization. So I think what maybe we've not been taught and not realized in this modern era is that we are not really, I am not just me, right? But I am a we. And so this idea of I have to take care of myself, or I'm going to be separate from other people, or what is my identity as opposed to that person's identity, as opposed to that country's identity, etc., is, I think, actually where a lot of our suffering is coming from. That we're really actually very much universes within universes within universes, right? So we know so much now about the microbiome, for example, which is these billions of organisms that live in and on our body. And what we know is that those organisms are in conversation with our mitochondria, and those organisms are also in conversation with the world around us, right? That they're being fed and replenished and influenced by what's around us. And I think that this idea of us as being in this web of connection and really starting to recognize that and nurture and nourish those connections and conversations is really where I hope our future really is going.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing there as well in that is a sense of the relationality, the relationships, the circulations of movement in that. It's not a static idea of a web of connections, is it? It's actually really porous and dynamic, and has huge implications then for how we sense our way or feel our way through our relationships. For people suffering from fatigue in particular, Maya, what's the implication of these webs of connection, do you think?
Well, so just from a physical standpoint, but for me, I mean, I'll just begin by saying I don't really see anything as just physical. I think, we have these, again, kind of these very reductionist ways of looking at our beings, but really we're physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and ecological beings, right? And that's all within us. So, but just let's say from a more scientific standpoint, a lot of what we know about fatigue really stems from mitochondrial function. And even mitochondria are these very spiritual kind of entities because what we are pretty certain about now, if we can say that anything is certain at all, is that mitochondria actually evolved from bacteria, evolutionarily, right, before we could even fathom And that's actually what allowed us to evolve to be these complex creatures that we are, is sort of the partnering between the bacteria and the eukaryote like together. And so, but mitochondria are actually what we thought they were, you know, if we learned in high school biology or whatever, is these powerhouses of the cell, and they make our energy, right? Which kind of connects obviously to, you know, do we have energy? Are we fatigued, etc.? But it turns out that mitochondria are much more than that. They're actually these sentinels, and they're always sampling the community around them. And not only are they sampling that community, but they're in conversation, as I said, even with the bacteria in our body. And they communicate, and this I think is so mind-blowing, through something called quorum sensing, which is actually how bacteria communicate with other bacteria. So it's like they're still connected to their ancestral lineage of being bacteria and communicate with bacteria in this way. So, and they're sampling the environment, they're connecting to things toxic and, you know, nourishing and so on and so forth. And actually what we know now also is that mitochondria change their configuration based on their sense of safety, their sense of connection. So when they're very nourished and nurtured and feel that they are in a safe environment, they actually are branched spaghetti in their form. And when they are in what we would call cell danger mode, they're in a meatball form, where they're actually not able to accept nutrients or messages or information or support from their neighboring mitochondria and cells and so on. So to get to the point of, you know, what's happening from the standpoint of fatigue and how this all translates, is that mitochondria are these incredibly sensitive sentinels that are determining so much about what's happening in every cell. And when they are in conversation in the right ways and connection and in relationship, what we might say right relationship, then the mitochondria are more productive and more energized, literally. And when they are not, right, when they're isolated and disconnected, they are actually, you know, we will experience less functional, optimally functional mitochondria, and therefore actually from a practical standpoint experience fatigue, brain fog, all of the kinds of, you know, immune dysfunction, gut issues, all of the things that, you know, come along with chronic fatigue and countless other chronic health issues.
So you mentioned there the practical landing of this. Can we flip that around, and can I get you to talk about the practical implications for people suffering from fatigue? How then do they approach this incredibly intimate set of intelligences that make up their own body with practical strategies? What would you advise them in terms of how to send those safety signals to those mitochondria and their relationships?
Well, I think the way I would begin is really just big picture rather than getting too granular. The first thing I would say is to be sweet with yourself. And I know that sounds like, what the heck is this neurologist talking about? But really, I think we can all think about the messages we're saying to ourselves all of the time. And even the way we approach being ill, like, is it a blame thing? Is there a shame thing? Is there guilt? Is there, I'm not doing enough? You know, all of the things that all of these stories and messages that we have internalized that are not even really ours, but are from our parents or our lineage or our society, or, you know, what healthcare professionals have said, all of, you're not doing enough, you know, if only you would, right? All of these things. So I actually think that that shutting down can definitely be a result of embodiment of trauma, right? We know that trauma is actually now not the event itself or events that happen to us, but how our body holds those events is really what trauma is. Because the same event for one person, you know, they can walk away and be completely fine, you know, and another person can really be knocked off the horse and, you know, struggle to get back on for decades. So, so I think that releasing of stories and being in that place of sweetness. And that's a practice. It's an art and it's a practice. To not make these demands of ourselves. So for me, when I'm practically speaking, when I'm, working with a client or a patient, I will just start by not even asking their bodies to do anything at all, right? I'm not going to try to heal them or, any of the, because the healing comes from within.
Mhm.
And what we want to do is start a conversation, right? A sweet conversation with the, let's say with cells, epigenetics, mitochondria, organ systems, emotions, spirit, right? All of these things which are all, it's the same conversation, right? It's not like these are all different conversations. This is one conversation and it's the one you're having with yourself, so practically the first thing I'll do is just talk about like, how are you nourishing yourself? What sweet things are you doing for yourself? Like, how are you giving to yourself? Because, I think of our bodies as being these very sacred containers that we're very, we can think of ourselves spiritually or all these different things, or, oh, like I hate my body, right? But the reality is this is this incredible experience that we get to have to be in bodies. And so thinking of our bodies as these sacred containers for us, we want to think, how can we be in reciprocity, right? With this body. And that means giving in nice ways, offerings, right? And those offerings could be rest, right? Those offerings can be good nourishment instead of, things that might be junky or, make us feel ill, right? It could be giving ourselves time to make art or to sit outside in nature or just be in the sun or give ourselves a vacation, right? For a few days. I mean, I'm, you know, and sometimes when we don't do that, we're forced to do it, right? Like that's, I think sometimes part of what chronic fatigue can be is like, oh, you're not going to take care of yourself, well then you're going to have to stop doing all of the things, right? There can be that component, and I don't think that's the whole story, but it sometimes is a part of the story. So practically starting with, what are you giving to yourself? How are you treating your body as this sacred container and being, you know, being in right relationship with yourself? And then once you've done that and taken time to do that and sort of, right, like gotten your mitochondria from spaghetti, from meatballs into spaghetti, where they can start feeling safe enough to receive, then you can start asking them to do these bigger things, which is healing, right? And no one's going to do that for you. That's going to be something that's going to come from within. So it makes sense to start, to my mind, from that kind of place of giving.
Yeah, and it really comes back to what you said at the beginning about kind of the way that we're disconnected, because it strikes me listening to how patterned this is, how fractal it is. It goes from like the closure to the opening of the mitochondria, the closing to the opening of relationships that we might have, our lack of safety, maybe in deep attachment material from our early preconscious material, and then the closure and the opening of communities, the closure and opening of worldviews. I mean, there's just such a strong pattern here in what you're saying that links what you're saying about health at the most intimate, most micro of levels, all the way up to ecology and planetary considerations. So if there was a message that fatigue was giving, not just to an individual, but to us as a Western society in particular, what would you think that message is?
Well, I think it's really understanding that we're always held in relationship. So
Mm.
the thing that I find across the board in people who are struggling, and that could be from chronic fatigue or any kind of condition that has a fatigue associated with it, or depression, or just or right, everything, people feel like their suffering is different than everybody else's suffering, that their suffering is unique and separate right? And of course, our stories are each unique, and our particular experiences are ours and are unique. But what I can say as someone who holds space, intimately for so many people, thousands of people over decades, is that everybody has their suffering. Everybody is navigating their trauma that they're holding and the stories that they are stuck in. And it's really a group effort if we allow it to be, right? That we're held by what's within us. We're held by our ancestors and by the people around us. And if we are not held by the people around us, that's sometimes an indicator of where our energy, might be siphoning off, right? I remember a time where I went through very significant fatigue. And in my case, and I don't say this is true for everyone, it was a marriage I had to leave because actually my energy, my big energy was sort of being really pulled into, not by a bad person, not by a person who wished ill of me in any way, but simply, our dynamic was one where my energy was feeding another person, and it was it was draining me very, very profoundly. So relationships between people can cause that. Relationships between, in communities, right? I mean, I think finding community is profound. And one of the things I can say about modern times is it is more isolating, but it also in some ways allows us to be connected in very profound ways because of technology and the internet and things like that. So and obviously nature, right, is just being in that sense of connectedness, both in the visible natural world and the invisible that really exists, sort of this eternal knowing, and the cycles of the moon and the sun and the seasons and all of these things are part of what we're always in conversation with as well. So yeah, I think that's a really important piece to this.
Yeah, and the key word I heard there was the myth of the separate. That was the point that you seem to really emphasize. And I find it really fascinating that lots of people are talking about mind body, increasingly mind body. And of course, the reason we even talk like this is because we've had 300 years or more of falsely believing in a separation. And it seems to me a lot of medical practice buys into that still, that separation. I think a lot of people suffering from chronic fatigue are told it's all in their head, as if this is somehow some separate realm of something that doesn't somehow have a unity of a kind of connective tissue running through it of the kind of biology of the brain, the nervous system, and all those relational sensings in the basic sense of security and safety and being in the world. And what I'm hearing you saying is that relationships in the self, relationships beyond what we think of as the self, is critical to finding these energetic pathways to well-being. But the quality of that relationship is key. The quality of the energetic match in that relationship is key. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I was just going to add something, which is that part of one of the things that I teach about and coach people through is actually working with plant medicines and psychedelics.
Mm.
And I think the immersion, the reemergence of these medicines that, are very ancient and were, many people believe, part of how we evolved as human beings. I think part of what they do from a neurological standpoint, and actually from even a mitochondrial standpoint, is reconnection, right? They improve neuroplasticity. They actually give us on a cellular level a sense of safety and support. So I think, and then of course from a more profound sort of consciousness standpoint, help people to feel more connected. Now, it's not to say I think this is the answer to everything, right? The answer, I think, is in coming to the understanding and realization and engagement of that relationship. And I think that these plant medicines are a portal, right? They're a doorway for some people who need that kind of experience, whether in a macro dose or a micro dose way. But the point is that I think that is part of how we're able now in mainstream medicine to start a conversation around mind, body, spirit, where we were not able to do that for hundreds of years.
Which is a wonderful door to open, isn't it? With all sorts of possibilities for all sorts of people.
Yeah.
So I guess we're thinking then about plant intelligences as co-evolved partners I mean, we're very late on the scene, aren't we, Maya? We are so late on the scene. And actually, everything you've been talking about is these ancient forms of which we're composed, whose evolution is much, much longer than ours. Mitochondria, as you said, ancient intelligences. So I think there is a real message here about perhaps learning a humility in relation to the more than human world in which we're living. And that really speaks back to the existing system, which is so destructive of so many life forms and so many modes of living and being. Is there a message that people with fatigue who are on this journey have that is proactively, powerfully helpful in the contemporary situation, do you think?
I mean, I think when people are stuck in that place of fatigue or feel stuck in that place of fatigue, there is an opportunity to recognize these sort of the toxicity of the systems that we're in. And I think that it is actually a beautiful opportunity if when we can view it that way, right? It's not always possible because it's very easy to get into a very dark place sometimes when, especially when we feel physically ill. But I think there is this opportunity to bring a message back from that, walking through the dark night of the soul and really look for, the way I think of it is salugenesis, right? So my dear friend and mitochondrial scientist, Robert Navio, talks about this concept of, pathogenesis being the road to disease, right? Which is what medicine talks about all the time. Salugenesis being the road to well-being, health and well-being. And so what I think about as the message, right, that people who are coming back from chronic fatigue really have is, what is my particular practice of salugenesis? What is my road back? The things that make me feel alive and, and bring me to life, literally. Those are salugenetic practices, right? Practices of salugenesis, which, as you said earlier, it is a practice. It is fluid. It is not static, right? It's not, oh, I'm doing this and therefore, everything's going to get better. It's what's making me light up right now? What makes me feel excited right now? What makes me feel alive? And those can be physical things. Those can be relational things. Those can be creative things, right? Just incorporating that back in. And I think we've lost that from our society, this sort of capitalist, commoditizing society where we all feel like if we're not functional, then we're not useful, and we're not important and we don't have value. So what if our value, and I think people with chronic fatigue are really the, canaries on this, but also really the messengers, is actually, I have value by connecting to what makes me feel alive and energized in whatever that may be,
Yeah, and I get excited thinking about that sort of thing, because I sort of think about the impact on the collective conscious and unconscious of what happens when people really start to evolve emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, even if And some people are very debilitated. I mean, I myself spent almost 2 years pretty much in a bed. But even in that situation, which was absolutely awful, there was a level of awakening, growing, evolving that I can look back on now and just be grateful that I had the experience, that I wasn't grateful at the time. But with the understanding we're gaining increasingly through the kind of work people like you are doing and the cutting edge science that we're seeing coming out of, you know, the new biology, the new physics, the developments we're seeing in understanding evolutionary spirituality and all sorts of things like that, it seems to me that there's a wonderful opportunity as well, even for people who are feeling very debilitated, not to feel that they're dysfunctional, but because there is something they're doing. I mean, the definition, as you said, of the system's view of function is so reductive, and there is a richer, more generous view of what it means to count, what it means to matter, and the ways in which we come to matter can be so various and so fluid and so subtle sometimes. And it seems to me that there's something there as well, Maya, along the lines that you're saying, that people coming out of chronic fatigue are messengers, but I also think people still in the depths are doing something amazing at some level for themselves and by definition, therefore, for others.
I think it's really like a decommoditizing of ourselves
Mm.
as human beings, right? Like not thinking of ourselves as workers, but as
Yeah.
inherently valuable beings, you know, physical, mentally, emotional, spiritual, ecological beings in this beautiful web. And I do think that, you know, it can be sometimes, you know, these periods, these very debilitated periods, which can be physical, can be mental, right? Where we're
Mm.
checked out of ordinary life and we're in this non-ordinary period, which
Yeah.
is maybe sometimes filled with a lot of struggle and suffering. It's like the death of an old self and an opportunity to really, even if it doesn't feel that way at the time, an opportunity to really come forth as a new person and sometimes free of a lot of those old stories. These stories are old, like hundreds of years old, right? Or more. So this isn't, it's not a small kind of death that I think many people are going through, whether they're dealing with chronic depression or, you know, right? Like this isn't just, it isn't just one way that it looks, but certainly I do think that chronic fatigue in particular, that is part of the story.
Yeah. Maya, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. I think you have a gift for the audience. Perhaps you'd like
I
to tell them
do.
about that.
Yeah, I have two things. I have, and I'll make sure you have links to this. Uh, it's an earth medicine bundle, which are just ways of connecting to the earth and natural world through grounding, meditation, plant cleaning, things that I teach in my programs. And also I will share a just a little introduction that I have to psychedelics for people who may be interested in learning about those medicines as well, because they
Mm.
both have their, I think, their place for people who are dealing with chronic fatigue.
Well, it's absolutely wonderful to hear that from someone with your particular expertise, training, and experience. I love the way that you bring the cutting edge science and the ancient wisdom together. It's absolutely wonderful. And it's been great speaking to you. And I just want to say goodbye to everyone and thank Maya for giving us such a fantastic insight into chronic fatigue and into the cutting edge science and the deeper patterns at work here. So thank you very much, Maya.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.